Okay, we'll call the meeting back to order. Before you start, Jordan, we have something left over from this morning we need to address with Patricia. Do you have the information we requested this morning?
Yes, Chairwoman. It will be August 5th from 11 to 3 p.m. And what we'll do is we will not close Quicksilver or social services down completely. And we will have calls forwarded to those individual divisions to make sure that we stay on top of things. There will be people in place to handle the normal daily business.
Okay, could you repeat the dates and times again?
August 5th from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. It's only for a couple of hours. And I will do up a flyer and get that out to Rob if it's approved.
Okay, I would entertain a motion to approve the request for the DHRD.
So moved, Madam Chair.
Okay, motion by Martin, second by Mike. All those in favor? Opposed? Abstain? Charmel abstains. Motion carries.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Have a wonderful afternoon.
You too. Okay, now we're ready for the cultural waterways discussion. Can you use your mic, please?
All right. Madam Chair, members of council, it's really exciting to be here today to present on the Cultural Waterways Ordinance. With me is Chelsea Colwyn, Thompson Smith. I'm not sure if Tony Incasholo is able to log on, and I see Tom McDonald down there. So we'll each have pieces for you to bring you up to speed on where we're at. So just to give you guys a recap of where this project came from, in 2017, I was working with the Yale Environmental Protection Clinic at their law school, and we had just finished a draft of the probate code, and so I think we're going to have a discussion on that upcoming soon, so I won't give you any spoilers on that. But after we were done with the draft probate code, we were wondering, well, what's next? Are we going to just kind of break up the team, or are we going to keep the band together? And so we were wondering if there were other projects we could work on that would be beneficial to the tribes. So in talking to Rhonda, and then I think I was talking to Thompson Smith, he just said that there was an effort to create a cultural waterways ordinance, and this was started in the mid-2000s, but it kind of had stalled out, and so we revitalized that project with the Environmental Protection Clinic at Yale, and this is the result of that. So since 2017, we had conversations with a variety of departments that work with riversheds, including the Lands Department, Natural Resources Department, Forestry, Preservation, and both culture committees. All committees have signed off on this ordinance that you guys are looking at today. We last presented this ordinance to Tribal Council in 2019, and at that time, Council asked us to put the ordinance out for public comment, which we did. We had 2 public meetings. One was in Polson and one was in Arlee. We had a variety of folks at those meetings. They're actually pretty interesting. A lot of non-Indian folks came to the meetings, and at first you could sort of feel some tension in the room, but as we started talking through the ordinance and what it did, I felt like we all walked out pretty much friends. Everyone really cares about the river and what we were trying to do on the river, and so at the end of those meetings, I think everyone was on the same page. You can look at the public comments in your packets. I believe that's page 97 to 105. There are also a number of folks that included their comments via email, and so I think those probably start at a page 100, and those are really interesting to read. We have some really good comments from tribal members. So overall, I'd say the public comment period was very successful. We got a lot of positive comments, some good feedback, but just led to really good discussion overall. Then 2 things stalled the Cultural Waterways Ordinance process. The first, if you guys all remember, around March of 2020 last year, our world got turned upside down with COVID, so that was one big thing that stalled. And the other thing was our water compact is going through Congress. And so the cultural waterways and the water compact really have nothing to do with one another, but there could be a perception that they could. And so we wanted to make sure that those were separated out as we were trying to pass our water compact. So with our water compact passed, we're now turning our attention back to this cultural waterways ordinance. So I think we'll get the Culture Committee's perspective on where this came from, and then we'll have Chelsea walk you guys through the ordinance, and then hopefully Tom can talk about some of the regulating and the next steps we need to take with that. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Salish Kalispé Culture Committee. Oh, I do see Tony joined, and so if you guys want to talk about sort of your where the ordinance came from, your thoughts on just the importance of the river, and anything in general. This is kind of your guys' baby, so take it away.
I can't talk as fast as you, but I'll try here. Well, the river has always been very important to the tribes, to the elders, to the people that use it. And it's been thought about for many, many years, long before where it's gotten today. For the elders to think about how to protect, how to preserve what little we have left as a tribe. We all know that at one time the reservation was reserved for the use of the tribal people. Our leaders, our chiefs fought hard to give us what we have today. And as we look around this country and how the water is being utilized, how our waterways are being destroyed, are being impacted in many different ways, the elders have always felt the need to protect what little is there, to protect those things for future generations. Those things are very important in many different ways, not only what people use it for today as recreation, but it means more to Native people, to Salish Kalispé people. It means more. It holds many footprints of our elders, of our ancestors. It holds many stories. It holds part of our creation story. It holds part of our plants, our food, our animals. So it's not just a place to recreate, but it's also one of the last few places that you can find secluded areas at certain times, which people need. They need these secluded areas for their spiritual ways, their spiritual needs. And those are disappearing fast. So that's another reason why the elders wanted to find ways to protect that. Those things that they want to protect are part of our life, part of our ways as Salish Kalispé people. Those are things that are needed in our circle of life. Without that, we start to lose those traditional values that were entrusted in us to pass on to the next generation. So that's why these places are so important. Very little places that remain. The Mission Mountains, the South Fork, were set aside and protected in ways that would hopefully remain for future generations. To look at the mountains and to understand what it creates, what it gives, and it gives the needs to the people, the vision quests, the secluded areas, the picture itself that reminds us of what this country once looked like. And as we look at the bottom, the floor of the valley, and how much that's changed, how much has been lost to our tribal people. We need to remind ourselves on a daily basis that we get wrapped up so much in the Suyapi world that we start to lose our identity as Salish, Kalispe, and Kasanka people. We start to lose who we are. We start to make things easy by adopting the Suyapi ways. Those 3 pictures that hang behind the council, those 3 leaders gave so much and fought so much for what we have today. And every day we look at those pictures, that should remind us why we're here, who we are, and what direction we need to be. We can't forget those basic things, those basic values of who we are as Salish people and Kasanka. That's why this river is so important. The highway from here to the lower Kalispels, it was used by our people to travel down there to visit. We have many stories about that our elders talked about those areas. So I just wanted to just add that to say that that's why the elders way back when, back in the 70s, it was mentioned when the culture committees first started. How can we protect those areas? How can we protect so that our children and grandchildren will see and experience part of their lives, part of their traditions? So to me, that's what I recall as remembering those words of the elders. That's why we have the river honoring. That's why it was started, to honor that river, to understand the importance of that river and what it means to the people.
Well, thank you, Tony. Is there anything else the Culture Committee would like to talk about before we go into the ordinance? All right, we'll move on then. Or Thompson, you unmuted?
No, just I'll speak if called upon.
All right, sounds good. All right, so I think Tony laid it out beautifully for us as to the importance of our waterways. I remember one of the kind of first assignments on the project was Thompson Smith took me and some of the Yale students on a river float, and we took canoes down the river. And so I'd worked on the ordinance, but I've never actually floated the lower Flathead before, and so I could just feel the power there. And that was just one afternoon, so I can only imagine, living there and kind of experiencing what Tony's talking about. So with that, I'll leave it to Chelsea to walk us through the ordinance and what it actually does. Chelsea's been working on this since the beginning. We're lucky enough to have her in the legal department now, as you all know, but it's funny thinking back in 2017. That's a long time ago.
Thanks, Jordan, and good afternoon, Council. Nice to be with you again. So I think Tony did a wonderful job of really explaining sort of the reasoning for this and the goals behind the ordinance. And I just want to give you a reminder, sort of walk you through what the ordinance actually does. The ordinance, the most recent version of the Cultural Waterways Ordinance starts on page 88 of your packet, and that version has the changes, the sort of in-track changes, the new suggestions that came out of the public comment period, which are just a few. I'm going to actually start in section 6. The first 4 sections are don't actually do anything. They just sort of lay out the authority and everything for doing the ordinance. But section 6 is where actually creates a process, a general process, whereby CSKT can designate rivers as cultural waterways. In order to designate a waterway as a cultural waterway, either the culture committees, natural resources department, preservation department, members of tribal council, or individuals can nominate a river for designation, and create a designation document for tribal council approval. And that designation document must contain a statement for the purpose of the designation, an overall vision for the cultural waterway, a timetable for the natural resources department and other tribal departments to develop a management plan and any necessary regulations, and also identify the lead staff and departments that will develop the management plan and regulations. And then once a waterway is designated, then the Natural Resources Department must develop a management plan or edit an existing management plan and submit that management plan to tribal council for approval. If any regulations are needed, then those would need to go through TAPO prior to implementation. One key change from the public comment period to consider is whether to allow for designation of off-reservation rivers as essentially as a symbolic indication of their ongoing cultural importance to the tribes. For these rivers, no management plan would be needed because they aren't on tribal land. But the tribal member who suggested this at the public comment meeting thought that designating off-reservation rivers could indicate to other land managers, particularly federal land managers, the importance of the river to the tribes, and also maybe lead them to consult tribes more, consult with the tribes more regarding land management of those rivers. So that's something for council to think about. And I just want to note that allowing off-reservation rivers to be designated does not mean that any off-reservation rivers will be designated. Council would have to consider those on a case-by-case basis, just as it would any other designation. And that's what happens in the next section. Section 7 is actually the designation document for the Lower Flathead River as the first cultural waterway. And it has all of those components of a designation document that I listed above. And so this designation for the Lower Flathead River was developed and agreed to by CSKT Natural Resources Department, both culture committees, tribal preservation, lands, forestry, and along with the legal department. As you'll see, the designation document includes a statement of purpose, which acknowledges that the Lower Flathead River, as Tony explained, is an area of the highest cultural importance to the tribes. It lays out a vision for the Lower Flathead River, which includes protecting it in perpetuity. It recognizes the threat of climate change and says that the management plan shall strive to minimize emissions of greenhouse gases whenever possible. It prohibits any additional dams from being constructed on the river. It prohibits mining in the watershed except as allowed by regulation. And so the idea here is that the tribes would be able to review any mining proposals on a case-by-case basis. And it would apply to, that would include on fee land as well. And regulations would need to be developed in order to provide a process for evaluating those mining proposals, and those would need to go through TAPO. It also encourages restoration within the watershed. And then for the management plan, the groups, the departments that worked to put this together had identified the following threats on tribal land that should be addressed in the management plan. And those were grazing, weeds and invasive species, development, mining, which is also on fee land, recreational infrastructure such as roads and campsites, and climate change. And so the management plan essentially would identify any prohibited uses or permitted uses and delineate any necessary boundaries for such uses. And a key thing to note is that except for mining, the potential threats are all limited to tribal land, which greatly reduces the tribe's legal liability. As it's currently written, and Tom can speak to this, the NRD and other departments have 1 year to develop the management plan and regulations. And we may need to revisit that timing, since we know NRD is extremely busy right now with water compact implementation and bison range work. But that is essentially what the two, the heart of this ordinance is: the general process to designate rivers, and then the designation of the first cultural waterway as the Lower Flathead River. And so, Tom, well, if there are any questions, I can answer those, but I also can turn it over to Tom to talk about, from NRD's perspective, what implementation will look like.
Is there any questions from council? No? Go ahead, Tom.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank Chelsea and Jordan for working on this, and I know there's been a delay on it. The interest, as Tony had said, goes back quite a while. The threat to our reservation from massive hydropower development goes all the way back to Senator Mike Mansfield when he was promoting the Knowles Dam, which would have flooded the river all the way up to the base of Post Creek Hill, all of Arlee, Dixon, etc. I think that was the first time the tribal council took action to try to prohibit further hydropower development on the Lower Flathead River. But we really focused early on with our river honoring program there was quite a few proposals to put in some re-reg dams on the Lower Flathead River, and completely inundate what so many people consider, as Tony mentioned, a place of solitude and importance for family and revitalization and hunting and fishing, gathering, etc. So there's always been a concern for it. About 25 years ago, we wrote what we call a Flathead River Goals and Objectives document. And it's been a guideline document that we've been using since council approved it by motion. It's not an ordinance by any means, but it's a guiding document that we've been utilizing to protect the core area of the Lower Flathead River from development, from housing, from mining, from other things that would be very destructive to the riparian area and the scenic beauty and the openness of the river corridor. So when it came about that we were talking about creating a cultural waterway ordinance similar to a wilderness ordinance, that was pretty exciting because it wouldn't be specific to just the Flathead River, although this document as it's written right now designates the Lower Flathead River as the first cultural waterway. And for me, a waterway is anything that really is it's a water course that's a river, a channel. It was used for transportation. It was something that's navigable. And so I wouldn't necessarily limit this the definition of this ordinance just to rivers. I believe Flathead Lake would qualify for this, as maybe other waterways that we think are important for our values. As time goes on, and even though the threat of large hydropower seems to have been put to rest, as you see now with the amount of climate change and climate refugees and the sheer amount of people moving here, it's a whole paradigm shift. It's very concerning for resource managers. As councils, you're hearing it from the membership. We're seeing lots and lots of people here. As the demand changes through time, I can't foresee what the future will be for water storage reservoirs, not for hydropower, but simply for water or another way to store water, or for potable water, whatever the needs might be. So as more people move here, as we look at these other demands for waterways and thinking of how important at least the Lower Flathead River is for us, for cultural reasons and other reasons. Every layer of protection that we can put out there, like the adoption of this ordinance, provides us more ammunition and more teeth to enforce regulations or modify policies that would direct the appropriate use and securing that important landscape for future generations. So really exciting about this. So what we would do is look at the current goals and objectives document we already have written. If we wanted to expedite drafting a plan and modify that to fit more into the stronger points in the cultural ordinance here, and come back with that as a first draft. But there are many things that could be added to it. You know, it all plays into also the issues that you have on hand on restricting non-member use. How we would do that, could that be a permitted river corridor? So there's a lot of little things that could go into the recreational section of this document and enforcement. So I think as we proceed in the next few months and we come back to you and present some of the non-member items, some of those will uses on tribal lands, restrictions or different ways to manage. Some of that will help shape how we would draft a plan for this Flathead River cultural waterway within that 1 year time frame. So we would do our due diligence and try to expedite it, since we have a lot of information. And one of the interesting things when we first started this is we were trying to figure out a way that we could zone non-member land. And one of the obvious things was to own the majority of the area that you want to zone. Gives you more of a protectable interest. Of course, we have our treaty to fall back on. But our strategy, since we were looking at that at first, has been to just simply try to buy all of the property. And we're fortunate the tribal council has given us direction. We've been able to use some mitigation funds. You know, the bad side of impacts is providing mitigation for some activity, but it has benefited us for buying a lot of the land along the river. And so we purchased a lot of the property along the river. And so right now, the tribes are in very good standing and position to enforce this policy or this ordinance, and be creative on how we can make sure we can get a handle on non-member recreational use or those people that are trespassing and violating whatever rules and regulations we might have. The other thing it does, it might give us more opportunity to seek outside funding to go after the invasive weeds that are out there, be more creative on being able to do appropriate stocking level for grazing, and a few other things like that. So that would really benefit that ecosystem. When I first started working for the tribes over 40 years ago, you know, to be quite honest, the river corridor looked a lot different as far as the plant community. And the plant community has really changed through time, from invasive species coming in, you know, a lot of bit of, you know, other impacts from overgrazing and allowing more invasive species to come in. So every acre of the landscape has changed. And then as we went through time and people started having 4-wheel drive trucks, when I was in high school, I can still remember some of that fragile soil conditions of the river. When you have very little topsoil, it doesn't take much to do a scar. And so a lot of 4-wheel drive tracks were starting to be created. It wasn't illegal at the time. You end up with a lot of scarring. And so you see that type of activity and scars that are still left out there. So hopefully this ordinance will give us more opportunity to address those issues, seek outside funding to help recover and restore, as Chelsea mentioned. There's a great opportunity to do a lot of that work along the river corridor, and restore it to what it looked like 50 years ago, which would be a fantastic thing to do. So we'd strive to do this. You have other waterways that we think are super important also, the Jocko River, the Little Bitterroot River, all the way up to Little Bitterroot Lake, I mean, even off the reservation. So, you know, our rights are those water courses, you know, adjacent to the tribes, flowing onto the tribes reservation are deeply important for us. And so we would also, you know, consider that other layering of going even outside of the reservation. If nothing else, a symbolic effort to add for extra protection through other federal agencies or state agencies. So it's a big step to be able to have this cultural waterway ordinance and to be able to use it to the maximum potential that we could. I think it says a lot, and I think it means a lot for the future.
Thank you, Tom. Any questions for Tom?
I have a couple comments, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Anita.
I thank you, Tom, and everybody. I appreciate the presentation. One of the things that I think impact that river more than anything is the human impacts. I think the controlled grazing through tribal lands and their leasing, I don't see the animals tearing up that river as much as the people, and we've discussed this during other presentations with natural resources. The recreation, you know, the vehicles, as Tom mentioned, I think the spreading the weeds when you got the multiple uses, that's half of the problem that I see is the multiple use. But I appreciate everything that you're talking about, Tom, and I hope that we can find a way to preserve it, because that's what I said in council a couple weeks ago is my concern, that we were given it and once it's gone, it's gone. So I hope that this ordinance helps us protect what's there and also in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Thompson, did you say you had a place names map that you could share with us?
Yes, Chairwoman Fayant, to you and to the Chuupan. Yeah, we have, as council knows, the Culture Committee, the Elders Advisory Council has been working for many years on documenting place names. And in part because it's just such an important part of the body of cultural knowledge. And I think the place names along the Flathead River, just like as these place names do in other places, really help convey in a way that not too many other things can, the cultural importance of these places. And I think I pulled up the wrong one here. Let me see if I can bring onto the screen. Is the map on the screen for you guys?
There it is.
Okay. So one of the things that there's been a lot of discussion about by the elders, and this is really just to echo what Tony expressed more eloquently than anyone can about the cultural importance of the river, but it just echoes it, I guess I could say. And you know, the name of the river has always been so interesting because it, of course, flows right through the heart of this place. And yet the name for it is just Intuit, which is the name that Salish speakers use for any river. But this is just river. And, you know, we've thought about that. And, you know, this kind of thing happens with other cultures and place names. So, you know, a lot of people know I was born in New York. And when New Yorkers talk about New York City, they never say New York City. They just say the city, because that's the city. And I think in the same way, we can understand that this is the river. And as Tony described, it's been of the central cultural importance from the beginning of time and even from before that, because of course there are coyote stories along the river as well from before the time of human beings. And the confluence of the Jocko and the Flathead, confluence of the wild plums, that's directly tied to one of your creation stories. So I would just echo what's already been said better than I can. And I hate to ever quote an anthropologist, but in this one little case, maybe there's something useful there, which is that Carling Maloof, who did work for the tribes during the Indian claims cases in the 1950s, and who traveled around with elders all through the 40s and 50s and recorded some important information, mixed in with some stuff that was kind of mixed up, but leaving that aside, he looked kind of at the cultural information provided by the elders combined with what he found in his archaeological work. And what he said was that the density of cultural sites, of archaeological record, was so great along the river and along the lake too, that he said it must be considered the center of human civilization in this whole area of the continent. That's how tremendous the indigenous cultural value of this particular place is. So, you know, I'll just kind of stop there and just say what's being considered is just, to me, it strikes me as one more example of the CSKT showing amazing vision and leadership on bringing these cultural values, the care for the environment into the present day. And just as the wilderness, the tribal wilderness was the first tribal wilderness in the nation, this would be the same kind of thing for a waterway. So, Lemdum Specia, and I'll stop my share, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Thompson? Well, thank you for sharing that map. That always kind of brings it home for me, is to see just all those place names and just all the history and life that's behind that. So thank you.
Una.
Were we looking for approval today, Jordan?
Madam Chair, I wasn't actually the one who scheduled the meeting today, so I think my understanding was you wanted to talk to us about the update. I think the two remaining questions I have is, number one, Ryan was going to reach out to federal folks just to make sure they're aware of things, and I would need to touch base with him on the progress of that. And then number two is I wanted to touch base with Tom and to see if right now written into the ordinance is that 1 year timeline for coming out with regulations, and I wondered if that was long enough or if he thought more time was needed on that. So I think just two brush ups, and Tom's here right now, so maybe he could provide input on that.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, Jordan, as I mentioned before, typically in writing a land use plan of this significance, and if there was NEPA requirements for it, we would not be able to do it within 1 year. If we don't have to do NEPA on it, and we simply amend the existing goals and objectives for the river corridor to match everything that was raised during this 3 year process, and what the main goals and objectives are in the ordinance itself, through tweaking with tribal council and the elders and other resource professionals, we would be able to do it within 1 year. But I'm not clear on whether or not we would be required to do a NEPA document on this.
Go ahead, Jordan.
So with that, Madam Chair, maybe I guess my recommendation would be to send us out for a few more weeks just to get everything tidied up and then bring it back to you for final voting, if that's what you guys would like to do.
Sounds good. Any other comments, questions? Fred?
Oh, I just wanted to say, looking at that map, Thompson, of course, I can't pronounce or read all the areas there. but certainly I just wanted to boast a little bit or brag, but I've been on every portion of that river from Kerr Dam to the confluence of Clark Fork River, and have many personal stories. First time I ever experienced hypothermia was right down there where you have the camp in the spring with the kids, school kids, crossing there on the canoe and tipped over. And by the time we got to shore, it was in September, but that water was still cold, and never realized what shivering meant until you start to see the first stages of hypothermia. And then looking at Horseshoe Bend and the Nest Burst Cabin, Big Bend, you know, all those areas, and never try to float that river from Dixon to Perma in the afternoon, because if you're in a canoe, the wind will pick that canoe, the front of that canoe up, and it just turn you around. You have to get, but I mean, so many, yeah. And going across from Magpie and hunting up on those breaks in Ferry Basin for muleys. But wow, you know, that is just similar to the wilderness. It's just, I mean, we have such an awesome piece of, I mean, I can't even hardly describe it, resource as a tribe. But I recommend, as Thompson said, or you know, float the river. It'll give you a whole new perspective. But anyway, just wanted to mention that.
Sounds like a field trip to me.
I'll volunteer to be the guide.
Right.
All right, well, I think we were scheduled for 2 hours, so we could just keep talking about it if you want, or I guess the last thing I'll say is what a pleasure it's been to work on this project. I've just learned so much visiting with Tony, and then we were visiting with the Kootenai Culture Committee and learning a bunch up there too, but just what a dream project for an attorney. So it's been great working with Chelsea and the other departments on that, and just always thankful for Ron and the legal department, because this is why I really wanted to become an attorney for the tribe, so been a pleasure. And so I'll bring back a final document for you guys in a few weeks if that sounds good.
It's great. Yeah, this is very exciting. I've camped at the river just a couple times, and there's one area where it apparently was an old dump or something. There's like all kinds of old rusty cans and things like that. And I was wondering if that could be addressed with, you know, Brownsfield money or something. I mean, I think that was probably pretty common back in the day, but it's like right along the riverbank. So
And Madam Chair,
go ahead, Tom.
yeah, you know, there's been numerous dumps that we have cleaned up along the river. We've removed car bodies. We've gone in the canyon with the helicopter up by the gorge and done some work up there. But that was back in the day, people had their own private dumps, or they were dumping off any coulee they could find. So there are quite a few of those items. But when you suggested doing, you know, any field trip, we certainly would be able to try to facilitate that. Any given reach of the river. You know, Fred's, of course, is a whitewater expert, and he knows that stretch as well as anybody. And then the rest of us, of course, I spent 3 years running that river every week, 300 every week of the year as a fisheries biologist. So there's a lot of stuff to show and a lot of things to talk about along that river, and it's very interesting. And the one thing that, and Fred mentioned this a little bit, big rivers that don't have development like this, don't have $1 million homes sitting alongside them, are becoming rarer and rarer in the United States. And so the Lower Flathead River is one of the most scenic rivers in the nation. And so it is extremely valuable resource for the tribes. And in some regard, it's a national treasure.
Fred?
Yeah, I just like to mention one other thing. You know, and Tom hit a nail on the head. we are fortunate that we don't see more development. And that's, another reason to secure as much property along that river as we can. But from Buffalo Bridge to Salone's, other than the old Nesper's cabin, you could see one residence up on one of the bluffs. And that is just almost unheard of. It might have changed in the last 20 years, I guess, or 50. I don't know how long it's been since I've floated it. But yeah, anywhere else there would have been houses lined up. So yeah, it is a treasure.
Okay, well, I just want to thank everyone for your work on this, and we look forward to passing this really historic ordinance. So, thank you. Una. Thank you, everyone. Okay,
Lemlem Strupen,
Lam Chotwen.
Shepest and Foot. Take care of yourselves.
Lam Hasselhoff. So next we had the bison range update. Did you want to go ahead with that, Tom?
Yes, Madam Chair, and I'd like to, while Thompson Smith is still connected, because him and I had a conversation about big medicine, and so I've been trying to follow up with that, and I mentioned at the quarterly meeting. Right now, the executive director of the Montana Historical Society, the museum itself in Helena, their executive board are very reluctant to have the animal moved because of the condition it's in. They're worried he might fall apart. So they really don't want to see him moved anywhere to anybody. And but they're still willing to talk about it. And so what I'm not an expert in that kind of thing by any means. I know Tom's sister, I believe, does a little bit of work into that kind of thing. And so I guess in talking about that, which is so important, I'm glad Fred has brought it up numerous times, is that to bring big medicine home to Moise, it may require us to hire our own expert or consultant to look at the condition of the animal and figure out, if he really can be moved and how much it would cost to move him, and then make sure we design that area that he would be secured in at the visitor center. So I guess in regard to that particular work item, I would seek additional council direction on it if you want to expend some resources on it. But I know that Tom and I had a conversation last weekend about it, just coincidentally. So I'm glad he's still online. Maybe he could address a little bit to you also.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Fred.
I call BS on those folks. Sorry to use my my language. For one, they don't realize the significance of big medicine. They really don't. They don't realize the spiritual significance of big medicine. There was one reference, Tom, earlier that you'd mentioned that, somebody suggested, well, you could just bleach out a better conditioned pelt and have that there. No, that's not going to work, because it's the spiritual significance of that. And I just, like I said, I kind of call BS on those folks. It's kind of like repatriating, bones and other art things that that was in museums in New York and all over the country. This is the same thing to our people. And anyway, I just call BS on that.
So, Madam Chair, Tom, do you want me to just chip into the discussion here a little bit?
Yes,
Um,
please.
So I think what's been said is exactly right. I think there's actually a number of areas of expertise that it might be a good idea to bring together in a and kind of figure out the best strategy to go forward. I mean, certainly it's really a wonderful thing that Steve Lozar is still on their board. I think he has less than a year to go, though. And I'd say there's about as much chance as a snowball in hell that Gianforte will reappoint him to another term. So he could really possibly play a really helpful role in this. As Tom McDonald mentioned, it would be probably a really good idea to contract with or make some arrangement with a conservation expert. And actually, the person who's been assisting the Three Chiefs Center with the damaged items from the fire, Nancy Funicello, I believe is her name, but she's actually a longtime professional acquaintance of my oldest sister, who Tom mentioned, who's been involved with museum work for a long time. But conservation work is then another area of expertise from repatriation. And, you know, if you actually go to the NAGPRA law, that gets a lot stickier and more complicated. And oftentimes these things can be worked out without going to that kind of legal hammer. So I don't know if Tom and council would think it a good idea to kind of put together a little subcommittee to kind of maybe begin with a couple Zoom discussions that would involve a few people who could offer some guidance and direction, and then develop a strategy from there.
I think that's something council would probably be interested in. Does anybody have any objections to that? I just go back to when I was at the People's Center, we tried back then in the early 90s, and we got that same answer. Like, he's too fragile to move.
Oh.
So. But yeah, I mean, better to store them here than in Helena. I mean, if we had them the proper controls, humidity and all that kind of thing. Fred?
Well, there again, knowing a little bit about, not a whole lot about construction, but you could build a frame around that, around that animal. And it's just, I don't know. It'd take a little, maybe a little effort, but I just think that's a poor excuse for not allowing us to bring. I just think that rather than to sit there in Helena, that Big Medicine needs to be here where it was born and died, and the cultural significance to our people. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just feel a need to say he belongs here.
Nah.
So does council support having a subcommittee work on this? Yes? Okay. Sounds good. Tom and Tom, gonna report back to us?
Yes, Madam Chair, we will do that, definitely. Just the other bit of debate that I had, I'm glad Shelley's had a debate early years ago on this subject too, was that they felt that they had a better visitation, that the exposure to Big Medicine to other Indian tribes and the public was greater at the historical museum, and I provided an argument to that. That I believe our visitation would exceed theirs, and if we end up with a new visitor center constructed, that we would greatly exceed their visitation. So anyway, that was another one of her concerns, I guess. So, but we'll work on that. Be happy to do that.
And Tom, I would just say Fred's point is right on, that those are just excuses, because the bigger question is who rightfully owns big medicine and who does it rightfully belong to? And that's the bigger question.
Bring them home.
Madam
Well,
Chair,
exactly. If he would have been alive today and passed away, he wouldn't have gone anywhere.
Right.
So that's the issue at the time, that there was only one avenue for him to do to save him in any way, shape or form, and that was the way he went.
Yeah.
But today's today, and just because it was right, decades and decades ago doesn't make it right today. So absolutely.
Martin?
thank you, Madam Chair, and Tom. I think we should probably pull as many stops as we can on this, and if it needs to, maybe possibly get Ryan Rushi involved and talk on the political side of how, if the Montana Historical Society keeps saying no, then maybe we'll go above them and make a request that they can't say no to. So let's be nice at first, but if we need to, let's by any means necessary. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Looks like Brian and Daniel have joined us. Is that next on your agenda, Tom?
Yes, it would be. Thank you.
Tom, Madam Chair, could I throw one more just item in there that might be a good part of this subcommittee? And that is Ira Matt might be good to bring in the discussion. He just was reappointed to a position with AICHP in Washington, D.C. So he might be helpful as well. Thank you.
Good idea. See if he wants to join the subcommittee. All right. Thank you, Thompson. Brian?
Good afternoon, Chairwoman, Tribal Council. I think most of you will recall Daniel Glick, who worked on the Bison Range documentary that has been and is so helpful in helping to educate people on the real history of the Bison Range and the buffalo and the tribe's relationship with them. He has been working on another film with respect to buffalo that does also address this history as well. And he wanted to know if he could do some additional filming on tribal lands within the reservation. And he was looking to try to do it in a pretty short time frame, so there could still be some green in the filming. So I'll let him describe the request further. We'd asked him to be here today so he could answer any questions, but he's probably best positioned to frame the request for you. So go ahead,
Yeah.
Dan.
Yeah, thank you for the time and for the consideration. The film that we're working on, it's the same team that worked on the Bison Range film. It's about what the Blackfeet are doing in terms of trying to establish a wild herd on the west end of the reservation adjacent to Glacier National Park. And so it's about the kind of the rewilding effort there and the specific animals that they want to release at some point are descendants of the Pablo Allard herd, of Shlatati's herd, the orphan calves that were brought over. And so when we talk about those animals, we want to talk about the history of those animals as well. And we want to do, it'd be a lot shorter, maybe just a few minutes, but it would be the telling about Michel Pablo and Shlatati and Atatitse and their role in keeping the animals alive for it to get to this point where they could be rewilded on the land, kind of in the lands where Atatitse or Shlatati rescued them, the orphan calves. That we want to just Well, what we're looking to do is we just want to film the land, the land, the reservation, like along the Flathead River, along the mountains, in the mountains, just where the animal, the calves came through, and where the Pablo's herd and the Pablo Allard herd ranged in and around the National Bison Range area, and then along the Flathead River is what we were told. And so we would, in telling this shorter version of the story, we would consult with, all the team members, Roy Big Crane, the cultural committees, Brian, Shane, everyone who was involved in that original film. We would be consulting on terms of the content, and to make sure that it's accurate. And but what we want to do is, while things are still green, to just get some aerial shots, some very simple drone shots of the valley and the mountains, and then shots with a little tripod. So it would be pretty minimally invasive. One person would probably do it. The same cameraman who filmed In the Spirit of Atatitse would go there, Zane Clampett, and he would just take a day or a half day to just get these shots of the land. And that's the extent of it. And then story-wise, which we would construct later, we would do that in consultation with the cultural committees and Roy, Shane, and Brian, and anyone else necessary.
Thank you, Daniel. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, the In the Spirit of Atatitsa was a really, I think, a really pivotal film in getting our message across. So thank you for that. Thank you for your work on that.
You're welcome.
So before us, we have the request to film on tribal land. So we have a motion by Ellie to approve the request, second by Martin. Questions? All those in favor? Motion carries unanimous.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you. And I'll be in contact, I suppose, with Brian to let him know when we will be there.
Okay, very good.
Thank you, Council.
Tom, did you have anything else?
No, Madam Chair, I don't. Thank you.
Brian, did you have anything else?
I don't. I guess I should just add for the record, I'll let Daniel know if he's offline yet, but probably Tom or the culture committees would be the best contact for him, but I can facilitate as best I can.
Okay, sounds good. With that, we have one more follow-up from this morning. Thank you, gentlemen. Have a good day. Mark, did you want to come up? Did you want open or executive for this follow-up?
Probably executive because it deals with some personal property